Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. This podcast series is designed for the supply chain leader who's on the go but wants to be in the know. Today I want to share my discussions with reporters around the world who are trying to write and give insights to business leaders about the impact of the coronavirus on supply chains. And as I do the interviews, I have a lot of reflections, and I thought today I would share them. First, people around the world are talking about supply chains in a new way. And this is a great education, unfortunately, but it's a great education for people about supply chains, what they are, why they matter, and how different they are. And the first thing that teams need to do in this outbreak is to map their supply chain from their customer, supplier. And I just remind you that most companies, when I work with them in training and I ask them to draw the supply chain, they won't know their second and third tier suppliers' locations, and they won't know their customers and their customer distributor locations. So the first activity I would do with the team is to draw the supply chain from the customer's customer to supplier. The second thing I would do is I would look for all forms of data that are possible to understand consumption data. One of the biggest impacts that's going to happen out of this unfortunate situation is demand shifts. We've already seen that at the local store as people are stocking up on water or toilet paper or, antibacterial soap for the hands. The demand for those products is just skyrocketing. Now, I would argue that it hasn't changed baseline lift. We're doing pantry loading. We'll still use the same amount of water and toilet paper, but we're pantry loading, and so we've got this abnormal spike. So that particular supply chain really needs to be closely tethered to consumption data, point of sale data, to understand how that's going to taper off for use of the pantry and what's going to happen to be able to move products forward. Now, in a fashion supply chain, which is long and lumpy and highly variable, I had a long discussion with Thomson Reuters this week about what's happening with the very high-end handbag and accessory markets. They're working with a number of companies in Barcelona and Italy, and their suppliers are worried about the downturn in the market, as they should be, because, in this kind of situation when we're hunkered down in our homes and we're being asked to not travel, the last thing we're thinking about doing is buying expensive luxury goods. And, the demand will shift. So the reporter said, well, what should companies do? And I said the suppliers should ask for consumption data, and the brand owner of that particular luxury good should try to give as good a signal as possible on demand to the suppliers. Now, we're not good at this, right? Most companies rely on order data, and order data has a translation from consumption data. And as demand slows, the demand latency or the translation from consumption data to the order elongates and it becomes more variable. So the first thing we got to do is let's map all of the sources of consumption data, whether it's point of sale data, whether it's rating and review data, whether it's warehouse withdrawal data, and let's try to use analytics to be able to look at what is market demand by locality to be able to guide allocation and assortment strategies as we struggle to get goods from other parts of the world, get them unloaded, to be able to make smart decisions on distribution. So this consumption data needs to be mined into a demand signal with as little latency to the markets to be able to look at how do I adjust the supply chain? How do I adjust the inventory buffers? Where should the inventory buffers be? How do I manage allocation and assortment strategies? And this requires really the assembly of people within the company of the brand owner to take this data and to mine the data at least weekly and to try to give a good signal to the suppliers, because when capacity short, as we bring factories back online in China and also Korea, we're not going to be at full capacity, and we need to make the right products and try to get the right products to the right market. And demand latency, or the time to translate consumption data to an order, is something we need to eliminate. We need to embrace the river of demand from the consumption through the supply chain, and recognize that demand patterns will fundamentally change, and they may not return to normal for a long time. In fact, they may never return to normal. Out of this virus, we may buy incremental hand sanitizer. The baseline lift of that may go up. Because of this issue, we may see a fundamental shift in what we buy in apparel. I don't know. All I know is no supply chain I work with is good at the use of consumption data, and people cannot rely on an order pattern and traditional forecasting techniques to guide them through this unprecedented time to give a good signal to suppliers. So map all of the forms of consumption data, get your data analytics, your data scientists, third-party consultants that you trust, form a group to be able to mine the data, translate it, and hold yourself accountable for the signal to the suppliers. The other thing is map the supply chain and understand where your suppliers are and where their suppliers are and where their suppliers are, and analyze the health of your supply chain. Look at where the pinch points are and think about what can you do to improve flows. Perhaps you need to invest capital to help suppliers who are strapped. Perhaps you need to work on platform rationalization and change what you're making based upon the shifts in demand. Perhaps you need to change the way that you're moving goods. Right now, the transportation and logistics in China, when a driver crosses a province, he may be in 14-day quarantine. Well, maybe you need to shift how you're managing supply to minimize the quarantine times. We've never had this kind of issue. So think about mapping your supply chain from your customer's customer to supplier's supplier. Look for demand data on consumption. Use analytics to translate that data. Hold yourself accountable and ask yourself the question of how do you simplify the signals for your suppliers to be able to get the right goods to the right place at the right time. This is not business as usual. Do not expect that you can use yesterday's demand signals. Do not expect that you can use demand forecast collaboration because your sales and marketing numbers will be off. And ask yourself, what is the role of the budget? Companies that tether their supply chain tightly to the budget are not going to do well. We need to have budget signals as a reference point, but as demand starts to decline in some of these major markets or demand spikes, we need to be sure that we are market-driven, meeting the demands of the market versus tethering ourselves to a budget, because one of the things we know is the budget is outdated the minute that it's published. And since many bonus incentives are tethered to the budget, companies that do not realign to the market will find they're not able to be agile in this critical time to manage the supply chain market to market. So recognize the limitations of the order. Don't tether yourself to the budget. Rethink employee incentives along with how you're changing the workplace. The next thing I want you to do is I want you to sit back and think about the supply chain that you own. And is it fit for function? As companies have attempted to move into growth strategies, whether it's e-commerce or specialized products or promoted products or products for small markets, we have elongated the tail of the supply chain, making products less predictable, smaller batch requirements, and the need for a more agile supply chain. But what companies have invested in is transactional systems to move transactions faster, not necessarily decision support tools to help us to make better decisions. And we also have invested in outsourcing manufacturing, outsourcing distribution, outsourcing data analytics, outsourcing processes like invoicing. And the more outsourcing we have done, the greater the issues companies have with data latency or the ability to get data at the speed of business. And the more nodes that we have in the supply chain, the greater the bullwhip effect. And that is intensified with variability. Because many companies are from either manufacturing roots in process industries or procurement roots in discrete industries, they are motivated and driven by metrics that are very functional. So in process industries, they're motivated by OEE. They want to get the most out of those production lines, and they're driven by a demand signal, and that demand signal is not necessarily giving them a good signal of what to make. And they're cranking product out, really focused on high volume, efficient supply chains, and outsourcing low volume items that are variable. The issue is that those low volume items are typically critical to the growth strategy, and the more we outsource and elongate the supply chain and make that more variable, the worse we're going to do. And so we're killing our growth strategy, and we're focused production lines on cranking out very efficient products that may not be the things we need. And so I say, step back, analyze where should things be manufactured to minimize waste, to be sure that you're making the right things and that you can basically synchronize the supply chain, not integrate, synchronize the supply chain to adapt to the speed of business to drive growth strategies. What happened in high-tech industries as the high-tech industry matured, they took their internal assets for manufacturing and they focused those on new product launch. And they took the very predictable goods and they took those to third-party contract manufacturers because they could predict those and they could manage those. A company like HP set up procurement hubs around the world to be able to manage these high-volume parts and assemblies at the speed of business. In contrast, in process industries like chemical and food and beverage and consumer products, because the legacy is to focus on OEE and asset utilization, those products have been outsourced and we're killing our growth strategies and we're making a lot of products that we don't need and are basically thrown away because of obsolescence. In discrete industries, the procurement function is very strong because we're now in an assembly, configure-to-order environment, and they're focused on purchase price variance. Only 29% of companies can see total cost. And so if I manage the supply chain on purchase price variance, I'm going to buy a lot of product at a low cost, but it may not give me the best quality. And so therefore, to be able to drive and design the supply chain of the future, I need to rationalize the nodes, look at how I send a better signal to the nodes. I need to look at which metrics are used. The functional metrics need to be aligned to reliability and balance sheet. So instead of measuring the lowest manufacturing cost or purchase price variance, I need to measure the reliability. In manufacturing, that would be first pass yield and schedule adherence. And in procurement, that would be quality of receipt and the contribution of procurement to total cost. It's a different mindset. And design then the supply chain to be able to balance customer service, cost, and risk. Now, many times people think, well, it's a simple triangle of customer service, cost, and inventory, and that is not a sufficient analysis. The asset strategy of asset utilization based upon coefficient of variation and what you choose to outsource are critical pieces to rationalize. No two supply chains are the same, and no two supply chain design should be the same, but the principles of supply chain design are consistent. Now, one of my struggles is only 10% of companies actively design their supply chains, and when they do design their supply chains, they're looking at how do I make a functional output more efficient. They're not necessarily looking at how do I combine source, make, and deliver and rationalize the form of inventory, whether it's platform rationalization or common ingredients or looking at, how the roles of the supply chain work for postponement of inventory. So they're not actively holistically designing the supply chain, and they're not tying that supply chain design to the decision support parameters within planning, things like cycle stocks or conversion rates. The strategic design should be tied to planning master data to be able to align planning systems. So let's back up. We need to manage the supply chain, starting with demand, managing the river demand, focusing on minimization of demand latency, demand translation, designing the buffers and the nodes of the supply chain so that we can minimize variability and align the asset strategy with variability and volume, and be sure that we can hold the functions accountable to reliability of the signal. This is very different than traditional supply chain practices. Traditional supply chain practices are about tight integration inside the four walls of the company, very focused on transactional systems, ERP, very focused on tight coupling to the budget, which is not a good signal of the market, not allowing bidirectional flows to look at total cost impacts, and not designing the nodes to be able to be the most effective against a strategy. So as we go through this current situation, it's a good time for you to sit back and think about your supply chain. Is the supply chain you have effective today? Is it adaptable for tomorrow? And are you able to outpace your competitors by being able to manage the flows market to market? This is Lora Cecere. Until next time, good luck with what's happening. Let me know if I can help.